This video is possible thanks to the generous support of all my patrons. Link is in the video description. Thank you for your support.
This is a stray note. Videos that are brief ruminations that don't have particularly strong guiding arguments, but nevertheless are small snippets that I thought people might find fun or interesting. This video isn't about paripi koumei, but I'm going to explain why it kind of is. So let's start with a really awkward segue. I'm particularly bad at anime music quiz. Many people who know me know that I absolutely refuse to play the game, and there's a reason for it. I don't watch anime.
OPs, dude.
Now, this isn't necessarily because I have something against them, I just tend to skip them. But I didn't skip paripi koumei or Boy Kongming, and that's really fascinating. Interesting. Paripi koumei is a PA Works adaptation, their first, according to people who know more about PA Works than I do, of a manga where ancient Chinese strategist Zhuge Liang, courtesy name Kongming, gets reincarnated into modern-day Shibuya after being after being enchanted by the voice of struggling artist Kimi Eiko. He decides he's going to make her famous. The show straddles between two general threads. The first is Kongming's real concerns about showing up more than 1,000 years in the future, and the second concerns the somewhat convoluted stratagems he employs to help Eiko succeed. It can feel at a glance like another kooky fun entry in the deluge of seasonal anime, and perhaps on a more practical level it is. I mean, it's not surprising we have something like this, that with the explosion of reincarnation and tensei stories pushed by an isekai wave, that it makes a lot of sense that something like paripi koumei would get this kind of treatment now. And the thing is, the subject isn't obscure. Kongming and Three Kingdoms, to put it very lightly, is very big. So it makes a lot of sense that a story like this would happen now. And the premise makes a lot of sense on a general basis. I mean, a strategist in an environment as brutal as the music industry, given that business has this fascination with war and tactics. Think about all the anecdotes of business people having to read copies of The Art of War.
Why I want to emphasize again and again and again is that Sun Tzu originated from war. That's why it's Art of War.
But let's talk about something a bit more abstract, which brings us to the thesis. Paripi koumei, perhaps as a result of its subject matter, is deeply interlocked with questions of national culture, that it acts like a moment in time which speaks and engages with questions of cultural authenticity. And it begins with that OP. It's catchy and rambunctious, and I love the imagery at play here, the collisions of cultures and subcultures. And apparently Bruno Mars? So yeah, it concerns an ancient Chinese figure in Tokyo, but the imagery is neither fixated on just Chinese or just Japanese. I mean, hell, its song quite literally is a Japanese cover of a Hungarian earworm. Now, this isn't unique. Anime sometimes is quite upfront about its influences. I mean, I've already talked about Tonkatsu DJ Agitaro and part of Tokyo's hip-hop culture, but you can also see more direct influences. The use of the Chinese, or maybe Korean, violin, the erhu, in Akatsuki no Yona. But I want to stress, for paripi koumei, Boy Kongming, that there's images drawing upon a wide variety of cultures and places. Now that brings up a question. Why not just talk about Tsukimi Eiko and her struggles in the music industry? You can still have these ideas. What does Kongming add to the manga and the anime? Well, first of all, he's cool. He's got that huge-ass fan. Okay. More seriously, let's talk about the elephant in the room. This is a big topic and has been covered elsewhere in much more detail and much better, honestly. So I'm going to just hit on the basics to get everyone on the same level. Romance of the Three Kingdoms, also known as Sangguo Yangyu, historical drama, was written during the Ming Dynasty by Luo Guanzhong, and it was based off of a historical text known as Sangguo Shu by the historian Chen Shou during the Jin Dynasty. Now you might notice, wait a minute, there's a 1,000-year difference. The transition from records to romance wasn't necessarily something that happened smoothly. Multiple variations and revisions of the records and the motivations of the people in them are based on the political motivations of the people making them. Luo Guanzhong was not the first person to adapt the records. In fact, the historical data and commentary feature pack by Chen Shou and later Peng Zongshu established a bedrock for revisions during the Song Dynasty. A lot of this is built off of the beliefs of the revisers as to how to grapple with what defines the legitimacy of statehood. Who owns China? Where does the lineage of China go through? Okay, that's a lot to really digest there, especially for people who aren't familiar with what I'm talking about, so I do really apologize. What I want to stress is that Romance of the Three Kingdoms has historically and remains a very deeply political text. It is inter-implicated with questions of who fights, who sacrifices, who commands, and what gives them the right. Keep that in mind. Okay, so with that out of the way, let's talk about the other ground rules. For this video, I'm mainly using the massive Three Kingdoms manga from Yokoyama Mitsuteru, the mangaka of Giant Robo and Tetsujin 28go, arguably because it's an incredibly influential work on its own and draws very heavily from Japan's own influential variant of the romance. But more practically, showing walls of text is kind of boring. For footage, I will also be using the 1994 TV version of Romance of the Three Kingdoms, which is considered the superior version in China, and is also the subtitling project of the Gentlemen of the Han, who are the wonderful people who helped me out with this script. So I do strongly recommend checking out their work and the show if you're at all interested in the subject matter. So let's talk a little bit about what it's about. The Romance of the Three Kingdoms is a 120-chapter novel, which concerns the pursuits of a huge number of picaresque heroes after suppressing the peasant revolts known as the Yellow Turban or Yellow Scarves Rebellion. The narrative spans from the fall of the Han to the establishment of a new dynasty, the Jin, where throughout its period, characters ultimately seek equal parts power and survival in the wake of one of the deadliest periods in human history. And I mean that literally. The Three Kingdoms period, while the exact numbers, as far as I can understand, are difficult to grasp, yet it still clocks up a rough fatality count that really wouldn't be matched until the 20th century. Okay, I realize that once again I completely forgot to explain very basic information, so let's try and do this again, alright? I'm currently 0-3 on this, but don't worry. this will be short. One of the things that's really important to understand is that in the wake of the fall of the Han Dynasty, there's a section of the Three Kingdoms where a series of warlords are functionally vying for power. And out of that chaos emerges three general players. You've got Cao Cao, the Machiavellian meritocrat with a penchant for attractive women. Liu Bei, the backstabber with a heart of gold. And the Sun family, who are just thugs. And then you've got a bunch of other people like Meng Huo, Lu Bu, and Kong Rong. So despite having a lot of characters, romance does focus around a central cast. And it's no surprise, therefore, that a lot of the characters kind of use these as a sort of fulcrum, which coincidentally also becomes the people who would then find or establish the Three Kingdoms period. You know, you've got the evil guy, the virtuous guy, and the boys. But it's also important to understand that despite Three Kingdoms as being credited as the product of Luo Guanzhong, romance is heavily edited. It's an incredibly political text. In fact, most people who will have read romance will have probably read the Mao Zedong edition, which was edited much later. In fact, the Roberts Moss translation, which is considered to be one of the best translations of the romance, uses the Mao Zedong edition as its base. Therefore, it's kind of important to understand that these characters, despite being, well, historical figures, have been heavily editorialized for very specific political purposes. And as a result, we're not just seeing these sort of unvarnished characters, but rather we're seeing very particular perspectives, and these perspectives have very specific goals. Now, I talk a little bit more about what some of these goals might be in the addendum video, so I would say take a look at it. But this was simply just a brief summary of who some of these people might be, or at the very least, who I believe to be the three most important players: Cao Cao, Liu Bei, and the Sun family. And in fact, when we talk about somebody like Zhuge Liang, a lot of his feats are tied directly to Liu Bei, who functions as largely the protagonist, or at least the most virtuous character in romance of the Three Kingdoms. So let's get back to the main video. The romance is deeply influential in East Asian literature. A lot of its characters have been sanctified to the extent where you have Three Kingdoms characters like Guan Yu have multiple giant statues devoted to him. But it doesn't even have to be literal. Once you're familiar with the general events of the story, you can also see its influence even in non-literal analogs. Fire Emblem Three Houses, for instance, comes to mind. Even by the admission of its developers, the game wasn't meant to be a Three Kingdoms analog, but there's a lot of similarities. The Church of Seros, on the brink of collapse, is fundamentally concerned with losing the support of its disparate nobles, and it's no surprise that to wage a cataclysmic war, three major powers emerge with different aims and start coalescing. And it's fascinating that regardless of which ending you choose, the solution is one where the continent, the realm, is united. The empire, long divided, must unite. Long united, must divide.
It really is Fodlan in a nutshell. The good and the bad.
But we don't even need to go into metaphors or analogs. Romance, especially in Japan, is a huge subject. Now, a friend of mine was working on a similar topic when I said that I'd be working on this, so I thought it might be better just for him to give an overview of exactly how deep this rabbit hole can go.
Thanks for having me on, Joe, and giving me the opportunity to talk a little bit about Romance of the Three Kingdoms in a fun, informative, and entirely safe-for-work fashion. I assure you, you're definitely not going to end up regretting this later down the line. Anyway, now that your neck has been broken by tonal whiplash, let's talk about some history. Because at first, while ya boy, Kongming, might seem like a pretty unique story, in actuality it's building upon a pretty long history of Three Kingdoms media in Japan. A history which is, in fact, about as long as its history in China itself, dating as far back as the 14th century, also known as the 1300s for people who can't count. Now, before I go any further, I feel that I should at least briefly mention that Romance of the Three Kingdoms was not the only work of classical Chinese literature being read in Japan at the time. After all, it's hard to ignore the legacies of stories like Water Margin and Journey to the West in Japan as well, because much like Three Kingdoms, they have both persisted well into the modern day, each developing into their own respective massive media empires. But I'm not going to talk about either of those stories, because that's not what this video is about, and also, I know literally nothing about them. But I know about this story, and I can say, as a 100% reputable authority on the topic, that Romance of the Three Kingdoms, at its core, is a story about war. And as we all know, war is about strategy. Let's talk about strategy in Romance of the Three Kingdoms. The most famous strategies in the romance are known as the 36 stratagems, a set of 36 stratagems originally detailed in an ancient Chinese text called the 36 stratagems. These stratagems include work smarter, not harder, do a little trolling, and the most important stratagem, run away when all else fails. Perhaps one of the most famous examples in history of one of the 36 stratagems being used on the battlefield actually comes out of Sengoku-era Japan. I am, of course, talking about Ieyasu Tokugawa and his use of the empty fort strategy at the Battle of Mikatagahara. Now, for the uninitiated, the empty fort strategy is a 7,000 IQ power play, in which when you are heavily outnumbered and holding a defensive position within a fort, you throw open the gates and taunt the enemy from within, leading them to believe that there is some sort of trap waiting for them once they enter the fort. The intended end result is them either postponing their assault, or just calling it off altogether. And as to be expected of a strategist as revered and masterful as Ieyasu Tokugawa, he, of course, lost the Battle of Mikatagahara. But I digress. Moving into the rest of the Edo period, Romance of the Three Kingdoms saw much wider circulation with the first Japanese translation in 1687. Now, right now you might be thinking, how could Japanese people be reading Romance of the Three Kingdoms before it was even translated into Japanese? And the answer is quite simple. Being quote-unquote literate in Japan at the time would have meant being able to read classical Chinese, similar to how being literate in medieval Europe would have meant being able to read Greek and Latin, something that was really only possible if you were a member of either the nobility or the clergy. So a translation of the romance into vernacular Japanese would have been a pretty big deal for the time, exposing the story to a much wider audience. And this is really where Romance of the Three Kingdoms starts to become a truly popular piece of literature in Japan. In fact, it was so damn popular that it laid the groundwork for an illustrated edition produced by 18th century ukiyo-e artists, which ended up only further expanding the story's popularity. So if you weren't already convinced about the popularity and historical importance of Three Kingdoms in Japan, consider the fact that it basically got a manga adaptation before manga was even invented. Now, by the time that we get to the end of the Edo period and the start of the Meiji Restoration, Romance of the Three Kingdoms had already developed into a pretty large media property, with a variety of adaptations into other mediums like kabuki theater, as well as new stories borrowing elements directly from the romance, like the Hakenden. However, two very important developments will come about during the Meiji era. The first is Shokatsu Buko, a biographical study of Kongming published in 1897, and this really increases Kongming's popularity in Japan, which of course eventually leads to stuff like Ya Boy Kongming. The second important development is the translation of the romance into modern Japanese by Kubo Tenzui, a translation that would end up being a favorite of a young Eiji Yoshikawa.
This guy here is particularly important. Yoshikawa Eiji's version of the romance plays a crucial role in terms of how it's understood, primarily because Eiji's version, which would become the de facto Japanese variant, had a few things going for it. One, Yoshikawa Eiji's Sangokushi weren't initially distributed as novels, but as serialized chapters in newspapers from 1939 to 1942. So, even from the beginning, Three Kingdoms material is very reflective of something that happens quite often, what we may call a transcultural flow, where material and data moves through spaces and people regionally, but it's constantly being negotiated locally. This is even more impressive considering that this is effectively a monstrously popular piece of Chinese literature being rewritten in Japanese newspapers during the height of the Sino-Japanese War. The second is that word. See, Yoshikawa's Sangokushi wasn't just one of many translations of the romance, it was a rewriting. And this brings up questions and discussions of authenticity, because we aren't running into a Tezuka Metropolis scenario where the author gets a vague idea of the original source material off a poster. No, Yoshikawa himself mentioned how when he was young, he'd grew up reading Kubo Tensui's translations from 1912.
When I was a small boy, I was transfixed reading Kubo Tensui's Romance of the Three Kingdoms till 2 AM, 3 AM by lamp, until my father would pester me to get to bed.
In other words, though Yoshikawa played a deeply important role in the explosion of modern-day Romance of the Three Kingdoms, he himself was influenced by a lineage of others before him. And it's those influences that would, arguably, shape Yoshikawa's rewritings. And these rewritings were influential beyond Japan. See, Sangokushi and its plot beats would move beyond just the Japanese audience. With the explosion of Dynasty Warriors, the koumei strategy games, and the numerous manga and anime adaptations, the Yoshikawa-based Japanese offerings would go on to influence new adaptations back home. For example, one of the big manga outside of Japan is Chenmo's The Ravages of Time, where the author himself notes that a significant amount of influence came from the Japanese rewritings, especially, or specifically, the historical manga and games, as well as Akira Kurosawa films. So, we're back at authenticity and transcultural flow, because these rewritings nevertheless play a role in terms of how new readers and consumers jump into the world of the Three Kingdoms. Okay, so if they're so damn important, what are the rewritings? There are a few on-the-ground changes. Romance is relatively scant on the motivation and characterizations of a lot of its female characters. It very heavily centers around its men, but Yoshikawa's Sangokushi somewhat addresses that. Liu Bei's mother and Dao-chan are two whose characterizations are fleshed out in the Japanese versions, and the stories start quite differently. The original epic is a summary of the history of Imperial China up until the Han.
Here begins our tale. The Empire, long divided, must unite. Long united, must divide. Thus it has ever been. In the closing years of the Zhou dynasty, 7 kingdoms warred among themselves until the kingdom of Qin prevailed and absorbed the other 6. But Qin soon fell, and on its ruins, 2 opposing kingdoms, Chu and Han, fought for mastery until the kingdom of Han prevailed and absorbed its rival, as Qin had done before. The Han court's rise to power began when the supreme ancestor slew a white serpent, inspiring an uprising that ended with Han's ruling a unified empire.
And it sort of just goes from there. In comparison, the Yoshikawa rewriting starts from one of its protagonists, Liu Bei.
There was a traveller. Affixed to his lower waist was a simple sword. He had voluminous eyebrows, deep red lips, rich cheeks, a stoic intellectual stare, and always a thoughtful smile. He did not give off the feeling of a low-born man. He was around 24, 25 years old. He sat on the grass alone, his hands cupping his knees. Time flowed with the waters. A cool, gentle breeze stroked his sideburns. It was the air of autumn.
It is, effectively, a more modern and accessible rendition of a classical tale. And this isn't an accident. Remember, I mentioned that Yoshikawa grew up on Tensui's translation of the romance, but Tensui's translations didn't do as well as Yoshikawa's. So, what happened? During the Meiji period, there was a deep division on spoken versus written language. At the time, written Japanese had a multitude of styles, such as listed here. And one of the battlefields of Japanese modernization was its language. See, at the time, written Japanese was also often written with written Chinese, so it was very different from spoken Japanese. Some folks wanted to compose written Japanese more similarly to spoken Japanese. This was called the unity of spoken and written language, or the Genbun Itchi movement. And while they ran into some initial resistance, by the time of the Taisho period, they eventually won out. So the more colloquial form of contemporary Japanese that we're more familiar with today was ultimately the victory of this Meiji movement. In fact, Patrick Heinrich, who's written about this, makes a really interesting note. The last residues of the old written style in public life were removed in 1946, when the new constitution was drawn up in the colloquial spoken style. This is an argument presented by O Chotsune. Oh, that's a cool name. Who makes the observation that retellings became increasingly popular as more colloquial forms of writing became the norm. Yoshikawa's offering, in this sense, can be seen as one of the first retellings. I think it's the first, but I'm going to say it's one of the first because I'm a coward and I'm hedging the bets of my argument, of Romance of the Three Kingdoms, and not only with this style in mind, but also with the approach to written language firmly entrenched. So why Yoshikawa? It's probably just because he knew how to rewrite the stories in the right way at the right place at the right time. And some of the writings affected the way these characters were presented. Cao Cao, for instance, one of the major players, and I guess you could say the antagonist, is presented in the original Mingjia-jing editions as a rather Machiavellian anti-hero, but he starts to become a bit more of an outright antagonist in the later and more widely well-known Mao Zedong editions.
宁教我负天下人，休教天下人负我。
In the Japanese adaptations, he's depicted with a notably more pragmatic image. In fact, that's exactly at the heart of what folks like Daisaku Ikeda and Jin Yong stress.
Idealism and pragmatism. Ideals that are not firmly based on reality are merely fantasy. Cold, hard reality without ideals is too odious. But above all, the result is that people are forced to make an enormous sacrifice.
This is important because you can see how it starts to shift. Yoshikawa's rendition concerns the stories of individuals who stand for something, and how they rise and fall becomes somewhat emblematic of the state of being. Now, this isn't necessarily unique to the Japanese rewriting. In fact, one of the things McLaren mentions is that Liu Bei underwent attempted reframings during the Song dynasty because he acted as a sort of avatar for political legitimacy.
乃汉室宗亲，今曹操以强欺弱，残害百姓。
These characters are often stand-ins for something broader, greater, and it's a recurring theme in the romance. However, Yoshikawa's changes, though they may be technical, are pretty thematically close. They're just more grounded for a modern audience, and the grounding is quite deliberate. Yoshikawa, at the end of the 8th and last novel, mentions how, in an attempt to ground much of the story past its mysticism, also ended up writing a somewhat nationalist drama. But he also made another big change, and it's how it ends. And this is where it gets really important. See, the original romance spans, quite literally, from the fall of one dynasty to another, but Yoshikawa's version ends with, spoilers, The death of Kongming at Wushan. This is not the end of the original romance. The Chinese version continues on. This is the end of the Japanese version. And this particular ending is quite important because Yoshikawa's reach influences a lot of how Japanese takes on the Three Kingdoms is understood. It's why many of the Dynasty Warrior games ended at Wushan. That's where Kongming dies. That's where the Yoshikawa stories end.
この戦は負ける。数々の仲間を失い。
That's where Paribi Koumei began. In fact, this mentality was so ubiquitous that when we get back to the question of authenticity, when Tatsuma Shosuke translated Romance of the Three Kingdoms into Japanese, he got responses from readers criticizing it and asking, why was this so different from the original?
This isn't romance?
The original...
What the hell is this?
Being Yoshikawa's rewrites. And Kongming was so popular that in the 60s, people were literally naming their kids after the guy. And at first I thought people were joking or that this is apocryphal, but when I went to buy the first volume, someone mentioned that he named his son after him, so I guess it's still happening. Kongming is a thematic bookend. He represents the end of something. So what was it, and why is that important? Kongming's massive popularity in Japan is primarily because he's kind of a perfect storm. In romance, Kongming doesn't show up at the beginning, but he's rather recommended, a polymathic genius capable in administration and statesmanship, adept in both military and civil engineering. He was a force of nature.
卧龙凤雏，二人得一，可安天下。
And he's quite important in terms of ultimately what he becomes, the inheritor of Liu Bei's vision. See, despite its title, Romance of the Three Kingdoms doesn't start with the Three Kingdoms. The story takes a little bit before it actually gets to the literal Three Kingdoms part, which is mainly kickstarted when Cao Cao's son, Cao Pi, declares himself emperor. Zhu Shu, who was employed by Liu Bei, essentially put in a good word for his friend.
哈，以我比之，犹如驽马比麒麟，寒鸦比鸾凤。
Who happened to be Zhuge Liang or Kongming, or koumei, you know, they're the same guy. So Liu Bei goes to Kongming, but it takes him a while to convince the hermit scholar to join him. This is the famous 3 visits, mainly because, like a LinkedIn recruiter, Liu Bei makes the pitch 3 separate times before Kongming reads the offer. And Kongming then outlines the Longzhong plan, which essentially dictates what Liu Bei must do.
先生之言，茅塞顿开，使备如拨云雾而见青天。
Kongming thus is very important as a character specifically because of what he represents. He's the piece of the puzzle that accelerates the establishment of Shihan, the beginning of the second arc of the epic, and emblematizes the ideology of the meritocracy. Kongming is the one who gives Liu Bei all the ideological ammunition he needs to realize his vision, and is arguably the most influential character to really establish the Three Kingdoms, plural, part of the Three Kingdoms narrative. But it's also really important because Kongming is an outsider. See, a recurring theme throughout the Three Kingdoms is the destruction of lineage, which has been allowed to happen because of the loss of the Mandate of Heaven, the quasi-animistic force from above which emperors derive their legitimacy to rule. All 3 figureheads of the Three Kingdoms, though they are deeply tied to the Han court in some ways, aren't exactly high up in the Han court at the collapse of the dynasty.
汝等小辈，安知朝廷大事？
The story is in effect partly discussing the rise of characters with relatively humble origins. relatively being the key word. They still have power to varying degrees. But Kongming becomes the logical conclusion of that idea. See, characters like Cao Cao and Liu Bei are people who rise to the occasion because of the opportunity afforded them in the chaos. But they're still relatively connected to politics. I mean, Liu Bei has ties to the emperor, Cao Cao's grandfather was a eunuch in the court, and the Sun family, arguably, draws their lineage all the way back to Sun Tzu, you know, the Art of War guy.
That's why it's
callback.
Art of War.
But Kongming came from relatively humble origins, and it's specifically through his intellect and his skill that he climbs the ranks to become the prime minister of one of the three kingdoms. And it is because of his presence that Shu Han survived as long as it did. He is, effectively, the one who fosters and defends the ideal of the kingdom. And that's why he's so popular in Japan. Most people generally attribute, correctly I think, that Kongming's popularity hugely exploded and maintained its dominance because of Yoshikawa Eiji's decision to end the story at his death. His death is also the death of Shu Han and the end of the dream. In the original Chinese, it gets really dark after Kongming's death, so it makes sense that he's the last of a noble era of idealists. But let's throw a wrench into that. Alright, let's adjust these glasses, boy. Let's throw a wrench into that. Midori Hakozaki makes a really interesting observation. While many Japanese drew inspirations from and comparisons to the Three Kingdoms, she notes that Kongming exploded in popularity during the Meiji period. And out of all of the Three Kingdoms characters, he is the most popular character to write about. And he doesn't even just show up in his biographies. Here he is referenced in the Hanahato, one of the earliest of modern Japanese elementary textbooks, and here he is as a topic in a cram book for junior high and high school admissions. Now let's be clear, Kongming's reference in Japan isn't particularly unique to modern Japan. A highly respected, though not commercially successful, bunraku play was the 1724 play of Zhuge Liang's military talk on the Three Kingdoms by Takeda Izumo. So why is it the case that he blew up in the Meiji? Well, it's because he's the inheritor of the dream. After Liu Bei's death, Kongming attempts to maintain Liu Bei's vision that he was a loyal individual. This is why the Yoshikawa story ends with his death. The first episode of Paripi Koumei isn't just a funny play on the Tensei trope. It's actually quite close in its subject matter to the Yoshikawa version. See, both Yoshikawa and Yokoyama, while they have somewhat different endpoints, nevertheless see the death of Kongming as the end of the Three Kingdoms. He was, in effect, the perfect subject for this matter, a steadfastly loyal individual, someone of immense talent and ability who doesn't rise to his own egotistical glory, but someone who is willing to fight for a dream, especially someone else's dream. And while Eiko's dream is to be a singer, not a fucking emperor, it's her dream. It's still a dream that he seeks to make come alive.
三度、英子さんの歌を三度聴かせていただきました。心が震え、この感動をもっと多くの人に届けたいと、そう思ったのです。
He is, in some ways, an artifice of the perfect modern Japanese subject.
为图将军之志，亮，愿效犬马之劳。
Especially from the perspective of the state, someone who sacrifices their abilities, talent, and ego for the ideal. So it's no surprise that the formation of modern Japan also saw the explosion of popularity for Kongming. But there's something funny about that because he's not Japanese. Kongming, in some senses, is a construct, someone or something borrowed from afar and remade, something that straddles the line between authentic and appropriated. What we have here are two moving parts, both of which are, funnily enough, expressed quite deeply in the show. On one hand, we have a very broad macro sort of narrative, where it expresses something that's been a mainstay of Japanese cultural production, to take something from abroad, blend and localize it, and re-express it as a part of its culture. And on a more intimate level, laser focuses on fulfilling this character stream, this crucial aspect of Kongming's character that has rocketed his way to cultural stardom. So in a lot of ways, it's very Romance of the Three Kingdoms. Hakozaki makes a really fascinating comparison, which is that Three Kingdoms, and I'd say Kongming as well, can be understood kind of like ramen. Something I've never talked about, of course. Ramen didn't come from Japan. It was originally Chinese, and then it blew up in Japan, and now it's one of the country's national dishes. Three Kingdoms is kind of like that. It began in China, but a Japanese version also blew up in Japan. But why did it blow up? Part of it is the movement between cultures, as well as a process of consumption and reconfiguration. Three Kingdoms in Japan wasn't just translated into Japanese, it was made Japanese. And I think with that in mind, the anime OP makes a lot of sense. The swirling of images that are notably not Japanese, but at the same time, it tells us, reminds us that we're watching a piece of Japanese media, a Japanese cover of a Hungarian earworm, frames rushing by like photo strips, but also like frames of an anime. And I think it's very appropriate that this happens for an anime, a medium that ever since its inception has grappled with these transcultural flows, whether it's intentional or not. They're images that aren't Japanese, expressed through what we often think of as a quintessential Japanese medium that, for most of its history, has been deeply dependent and reflective of non-Japanese influences. So perhaps, in a way, Kongming, and that large fan of his, seems extremely appropriate and relevant, making him kind of the perfect example.